I didn't plan to feel this way when I started this journey. I thought I was just visiting a few quiet towns, places most people drive past without stopping. But the moment I stepped onto these empty streets, something felt different. These towns weren't abandoned. They were still breathing, still holding on, even after being ignored for decades. Every cracked building, every silent road, carried a story of people who stayed when opportunity left. What I saw wasn't failure. It was survival. And the truth is, these towns don't need sympathy. They need to be seen. Once you hear their stories, it's impossible to look at rural America the same way again. If these real stories matter to you and you don't want them to be forgotten, make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay with me on this journey. 1 Mound Bayou, Mississippi. I remember the moment I first entered Mound Bayou, Mississippi. There was no welcome sign that explained its importance, no tourist board, no noise. Just a quiet road, old trees, and buildings that looked tired but proud. It didn't feel like a place that wanted attention. It felt like a place that had already lived too much. As I walked deeper into the town, I kept thinking about what this place once was. Mound Bayou was founded in 1887 by formerly enslaved Black Americans. This wasn't just another town. This was a dream built from freedom. People here once owned their land, ran their own businesses, and lived without white control during a time when that was almost impossible. Standing there, I could feel the weight of that history pressing into the silence. Many of the buildings were still standing, but barely. Closed stores with broken windows. A school that no longer had children's voices inside it. I stood in front of an old business and tried to imagine it full of life. People laughing. Money changing hands. Hope moving through the streets. Now, only the wind moved. What hit me hardest was how slow everything felt. Not peaceful slow, but forgotten slow. I spoke to an older man sitting outside his house. He told me most young people had already left. There were no jobs, no factories, no future for them here. He didn't sound angry. He sounded tired. Like someone who had already explained this story too many times. As I walked away, I realized this town didn't fail. It was left behind. When segregation ended, many black-owned towns like Mound Bayou lost support. Big cities grew. Money moved elsewhere. This place was pushed into the background of America's story. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much at one time. I felt something heavy in my chest while standing there. This wasn't just poverty. This was the slow erasing of a powerful black legacy. The land was still here. The houses were still here. But the opportunities were gone. Before leaving, I stopped one last time and looked down the empty road. I thought about how this town was built by people who had nothing, yet created everything. And now, generations later, the town was struggling to survive in silence. Mound Bayou isn't just struggling. It's remembering. And once you stand there yourself, you don't forget it. 2 Greensboro, Alabama. I reached Greensboro, Alabama just as the sun was going down. The light was soft, but the town felt heavy. The streets were quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the kind of quiet that comes after people stop expecting things to get better. I parked near the center of town and started walking, noticing how many buildings were closed but still standing, like they were waiting for something that never came. As I walked, I kept thinking about where I was. Greensboro sits in Alabama's Black Belt, a region known for its rich soil and deep black history. This town was once held together by farming and small industries. Families worked the land for generations. But when agriculture declined and factories shut down, the jobs disappeared almost overnight. What stayed behind were people who didn't have the option to leave. I passed an old school building with faded paint and cracked steps. It looked like a place that once held dreams. I imagined children running inside, teachers believing education could change everything. Today, many young people leave Greensboro as soon as they can. Those who stay often do so because they have no choice. That thought stayed with me as I kept walking. I stopped at a small store that was still open. Inside, an older woman stood behind the counter. We talked for a few minutes. She told me business used to be better, but now most days were slow. She said hospitals were far away, jobs were rare, and people felt forgotten by the state. She wasn't angry. She was honest. That honesty made her words hit harder. Outside again, I noticed how many houses were worn down but still lived in. This wasn't abandonment. This was survival. People were holding on to what they had, even as everything around them slowly faded. The town didn't collapse suddenly. It declined step by step, year by year, policy by policy. As the sky got darker, I felt a strange mix of sadness and respect. Greensboro didn't give up. It endured. Despite underfunded schools, limited healthcare, and lack of investment, people were still here. Still opening stores. Still checking on neighbors. Still calling this place home. Before leaving, I stood at the edge of town and looked back one last time. Greensboro wasn't loud about its pain. It didn't ask for sympathy. But once you walk its streets, you understand something important. This town isn't struggling because of failure. It's struggling because it was never given a fair chance to grow. And that realization stayed with me long after I drove away. 3 Clarksdale, Rural Areas, Mississippi. I arrived in the rural areas outside Clarksdale, Mississippi early in the morning. The air felt thick, and the land stretched out flat in every direction. Cotton fields sat quietly, some still in use, others slowly being taken back by weeds. This didn't feel like the famous Clarksdale people talk about when they mention blues music. This felt like the part of the story most people never see. Driving down narrow roads, I noticed small houses spaced far apart. Many looked worn, but lights were on inside. People were still living here, still holding on. Clarksdale is known as the birthplace of the blues, but in these rural areas, the music feels more like a memory than a living thing. The younger generation has mostly left, chasing work in Memphis, Jackson, or farther north. What remains are elders, history, and silence. I stopped near an old road crossing and just stood there for a moment. This land once supported families through farming and local labor. Over time, machines replaced people, farms shut down, and jobs disappeared. The land stayed rich, but the people were left poor. That contrast was hard to ignore while standing there myself. Later, I met a man sitting outside his home, playing a soft tune on a guitar. He told me he learned from his father, who learned from his own father. Music was once a way out, a voice for pain and hope. Now, he said, tourists come to the city for the blues, but they don't come out here. The money never reaches these roads. His words felt calm, but there was disappointment behind them. As I walked further, I saw abandoned shacks next to lived-in homes. This wasn't total abandonment. It was uneven survival. Some families managed. Others didn't. Schools in rural areas closed or merged, forcing kids to travel far. Healthcare became harder to reach. Each small loss added up over decades, slowly draining life from the countryside. What stayed with me most was how invisible this place felt. Clarksdale's name is famous, but these rural communities exist outside that spotlight. Their struggles don't fit into postcards or music legends. Yet, they carry the real cost of history, segregation, and economic neglect. Before leaving, I looked back at the fields as the sun climbed higher. I realized something important. These rural areas didn't lose their identity. They were stripped of opportunity. The blues may have been born here, but now the land sings a quieter song, one of endurance. Once you stand there yourself, you understand that rural Clarksdale isn't just struggling. It's waiting to be seen. For Demopolis, surrounding rural communities, Alabama. I reached the rural communities outside Demopolis, Alabama after driving past long stretches of quiet farmland. The land looked wide and open, but the feeling wasn't free. It felt restrained, like a place that had learned to expect less. I slowed down, rolled my window down, and let the warm air in. There was no rush here, only time moving slowly. As I drove deeper, I noticed small homes scattered along dirt roads. Some were cared for, others looked like they were barely holding together. This area once depended on agriculture. Families worked the land, season after season, believing it would always provide. But over the years, farming jobs dried up. Machines replaced workers, and big companies took over what small families once owned. The land stayed productive, but the people were pushed aside. I stopped near a closed store that looked like it had been important once. The sign was faded, but you could still tell it mattered to the community. I imagined neighbors meeting there, sharing news, buying simple things, feeling connected. Now the doors were locked, and the parking lot was empty. That emptiness felt louder than noise. Walking around, I realized most young people were gone. Everyone I saw was older. One man waved as I passed. We talked briefly. He told me his children moved to Birmingham for work. He said there was nothing here for them anymore. He smiled when he said it, but his eyes didn't. That stayed with me as I walked away. What made this place hit harder was how normal it all felt. No disaster. No sudden collapse. Just a slow fading. Schools merged or closed. Clinics became farther away. Public investment never arrived. Each small loss stacked on top of the last, quietly changing everything. I stood near the edge of a field and tried to imagine the past. Children running. Families working together. A future that felt possible. Standing there now, it was clear that the people didn't fail this place. The system failed them. Opportunities left, and no one replaced them. As the sun began to lower, the rural roads felt even quieter. But this wasn't silence from emptiness. It was silence from endurance. People here are still surviving. Still caring for land they no longer fully benefit from. Still calling this home, even when home gives little back. Before leaving, I took one last look down the road. Demopolis rural communities aren't abandoned. They are overlooked. And once you stand there yourself, you realize how many American stories exist far from the highways, quietly waiting to be told. 5 Allendale, South Carolina. I entered Allendale, South Carolina on a quiet afternoon, and the first thing I noticed was how empty the streets felt. Not abandoned, just slowed down, like the town was holding its breath. The buildings stood close together, many with peeling paint and dark windows, yet there was still movement. A car passed. Someone sat on a porch. Life was still here, just quieter than it should be. As I walked through town, I learned that Allendale once depended heavily on textile mills and small local businesses. When those mills closed, jobs vanished almost overnight. People didn't leave because they wanted to. They left because they had to. Standing there. It was easy to feel how sudden that loss must have been, and how long the town has been carrying it. I stopped near the old downtown area. Several shops were closed, their signs faded but readable. You could tell these places mattered once. This wasn't neglect from the people. It was neglect from investment. Over the years, funding dried up, businesses left, and opportunities never returned. The town didn't fall apart. It was slowly forgotten. I spoke briefly with a local man sitting outside his home. He told me healthcare was far away and jobs were scarce. He said many families depend on limited work or government help. He didn't complain. He just stated facts. That calm honesty made everything feel more real. This wasn't a dramatic story. It was everyday reality. Walking deeper into the neighborhood, I noticed how many homes were still lived in despite their condition. This wasn't abandonment. This was people surviving with what they had. Schools struggled with funding. Young people left for bigger cities. Those who stayed were often the ones who had roots too deep to pull up. What hit me hardest was how invisible Allendale feels. It sits far from major highways and tourist paths. When America talks about growth, towns like this are rarely included. But standing there, I realized how important these places still are. They carry history, culture, and stories that don't fit into headlines. As the sun started to lower, the town grew even quieter. I felt a mix of sadness and respect. Sadness for what was lost. Respect for those who stayed. Allendale isn't loud about its struggle. It doesn't ask to be saved. It simply exists, day after day, holding on to dignity in the face of long-term neglect. Before I left, I looked back at the town one last time. Allendale isn't failing because its people gave up. It's struggling because opportunity moved on without looking back. And once you walk its streets yourself, that truth stays with you long after you're gone.